Okay, so welcome. I mean, okay, actually, fuck the intro. Let's just go right.
Fuck the intro.
This is a Now Magazine podcast.
Hello and welcome to Now What. I'm Reddy Anzheim-Play, Now Magazine's acting editor and the host of this podcast. This week's show is co-hosted by Toronto writer and cultural critic Huda Hassan, who has a story in this month's issue of Now Magazine. That story is on Fatuma Adar, our featured guest for this episode. Fatuma is an incredible writer and performer who made a musical about her West End Toronto community. It's called Dixon Road. It's playing at the Canadian Stage Amphitheatre in High Park until June 19th. The musical is a hilarious, inspiring, and moving representation of the refugee experience that homes in on the Somali Canadian community. And Huda and Fatuma discuss the show, what it means to represent the community, and how the community has been responding to the show. So here we are with Fatuma Adar and Huda Hassan. So Fatuma Adar, thank you so much for joining this podcast. And Huda Hassan, thank you for joining me here, helping me co-host this conversation. So Fatuma, you have this incredible show. I watched it the other night with my kids. I watched the preview the other night. We love this show. Like I absolutely, and I'm not much of a theater person. I can't, really speak much into terms of theater terms, but I see everything in movie terms. And I'm like, I can't wait to see this as a movie. This absolutely deserves to make it get that far, to go that distance. Okay.
That's so funny. That was my dad's response too after watching it for the first time. He's like, it should be a movie. And I'm like, really? 5 years? Is this not enough?
Well, because we don't understand the language of theater. We're like, we can only identify it that way, no? Like,
true.
I get it.
Yeah.
Sure.
One of the things, having someone like you tell a story about your family and your community's refugee experience, like one of the things that jumps out immediately when someone from the community tells that story is you can capture the nuances of the class differences within the community and how, like there's people that have different backgrounds, different class as refugees, and they still experience kind of the tension within their own community while having this mass exodus refugee experience. And I love the way you captured that within kind of a single apartment in Dixon Road.
Yeah, like there's something that I feel like I always recognized growing up and like sort of how our elders or like somebody like my parents like hold themselves compared to how they're being viewed in Toronto. And I think that that's true for like a lot of African diasporic folks who come here, like leaving a country where everybody looks like them and like having like land from their home and like able to build a life. People don't leave things like that easily. So when they come here and they're treated so wildly different. I have the line in the show, which is like, here the only tribe you belong to is Black. Like all of the nuance of your Africanness is all like gone by the time you come here. And it's an entirely different experience. So I feel like there's a class difference in even how they're processing their move here. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and then I guess like we should just start off like, a big thing about your show is like, okay, I'm not from the Somali community, so I don't know all the kind of the nuances within the community. I know like, I think one of my earliest kind of journalistic kind of conversations about Dixon Road is when I interviewed Blackout, the actor, and he was like, yeah, Dixon Road. I'm like, how do you know Dixon Road?
Yes.
I am dead that Barkat Abdi referenced Dixon Road. That is very on point and on brand.
Like, because he was talking about his Minnesota community, and he was like, yeah, you guys have that community too in Dixon Road. I'm like,
oh my God.
You're gonna drop the Dixon Road. So but the thing is, it's like there's obviously this tension between how how the city of Toronto sees Dixon Road because of Rob Ford and his involvement there, and how the community sees Dixon Road.
Yeah.
And I guess that's not really even, it's interesting. That's not really referenced in your show. Your show's not about that, right? Your show is this alternative representation, or like the real representation in a way, right?
Yeah, it's an entirely different, like it's something else that you see rather than all the ways in which the narrative hasn't necessarily been allowed to be given to Somali people, especially in that community. Like I think that it's been something that people have reported on for a while, but like sort of the empathy in which I see the family and the community in Dixon Road is just like what you get from like the inside out rather than the outside in.
I loved being at the show and seeing people. They must have been from your hood that were like
Girl,
the
you don't
way they were
even
responding.
know. Yeah, there was on our first preview night, we went to a Star restaurant just before the show because Musical Stage and Obsidian like sort of arranged like a full bus to take people from actually Dixon Road to Dixon Road to the show. And one of the uncles that is also like a community facilitator who was on the bus was like, this bus is kind of empty, and asks the bus driver to stop at the basketball court. And then he comes back with like 20 kids who are like coming to see their first show all of a sudden. And we're just taking a bus full of children, Somali kids, who probably have never been to a play from Dixon Road to Dixon Road. And I love every single one of them. They had no chill. They had no like context as to what it means to sort of sit in a theater. They were just full and enjoying it and like very responsive. So I was just so grateful that like I've been in theater for a while and obviously the Somali community for a while. So seeing a moment where all my worlds collide was kind of wild.
True. I was going to ask you about like the beauty, the difficulties, and the lessons of making this play, but I feel like I'm also kind of hearing it in that response.
Yeah, like it's something that like, you know, when folks who came and saw the show, like Somali folks who like came from Dixon or from Scarborough or from Brampton, like journeyed all the way and were like, we didn't even know there was a stage in Hyde Park, you know?
Yeah.
And like meeting like young girls who were like, my parents also laughed when I said I wanted to be a writer, and see that represented in the show. It's something that's been really incredible because when you work on something like somewhat in isolation just with a team, you really don't, like, you just pray people will show up, and then people show up.
Yeah. What has the community response in person felt like after the show, during the show?
Incredible. Like people are for one blown away. Like a lot of people love the music. They find the humor in it, which is incredible. Like, and you know, they're just interested, and it's exactly what I want for like people in our community to have an entry point to like musical theater is like they're all of a sudden like this genre that, you know, I felt so lonely in as a Somali person now just has a bunch of like people coming to it. Like there was somebody who said that last night they saw the show 3 times, and I was like, that's wild. We've only had 4 performances.
That is crazy.
Well, last night was the Blackout performance, right?
Yeah.
Talk to me. Well, yeah, like first of all, like how often has there been Blackout performances in theater in the Toronto theater scene before? Like I'm such a heathen, or I don't know what the term is for someone entering the theater scene. But yeah, like I've never heard of this.
We did it. So in addition to like doing some writing stuff, I also like work as a producer in theater. And back when I was at Theater Past Marai, that's when we did our first Blackout night when I was working there. And it was inspired by Jeremy O'Harris, who did Slave Play. He had a Blackout night for his show on Broadway. So we tried to do it with this show called Negroes Are Congregating that I was doing the marketing on. And if you can't do it on a show called Negroes Are Congregating, where could you do it? And it was incredible. Like by the end of before the start of the performance, we were like scrambling to find seats because so many people had showed up to just be in a room with other Black artists witnessing theater. Because when you go to a theater as a Black audience member, it's a little polarizing, I think, because you kind of are unsure as to who the story is for, right? Like, will the thing on stage be centering my suffering from a point of teaching people who aren't experiencing it, you know, who are into me? So like being comfortable to laugh at certain jokes. Like I also went to Blackout Night at Is God Is, which was another Obsidian production that just happened. And like I went on a Blackout night and a non-Blackout night, and they were 2 very different things. So the Blackout night, like folks immediately recognized the humor. It was very much like the show is a a revenge fantasy with two young Black girls who are sent to kill their father who killed their mother. Like, it's a whole thing. And like the people who watched it at Blackout night like knew the tone of like Get Out, or like kind of like a Black Tarantino take. Like, we were able to like laugh at the slasher elements of it, and it was just like everybody was on like the edge of the seat, like really interested. Whereas when I saw it on a non-Blackout night, I think non-Black folks didn't realize the humor. Like, they didn't realize it was funny. So here I am like laughing at moments, but I'm like one laugh amongst a sea of no laughs, as opposed to like the night before where a bunch of people are responding to the same things I was responding. So last night was incredible because I got to figure out there's some jokes that didn't play except for last night in Dixon Road with the Blackout audience. So it was incredible.
And not to segregate audiences further, but it was like you know, like the night that I was there, it was like there was those moments where your community was responding hard, and then the white women beside me were like, "Why are these people disturbing my theater experience?" You know,
exactly. But what is your theater experience, ma'am? Let's unpack that.
Yeah. Exactly. I also wanted to say your show. I love that in High Park, that theater, that planes keep flying over above during the show. Because for like I guess it feels like Dixon in a way, because the airport's right there, and also just so metaphorical of like this experience, right? It's like it's such a, I guess, I don't know, unintended nuanced touch to the show.
Yeah, having it outside in general, I think, is great because, like, you know, like the formalness of theater isn't like right, I don't think, for this show. Like, I think that the ability for people to sit down, like, you know, hear all the activity of High Park and see a story about this family in between like all that chaos is probably the best way to experience the show now. And you're able to see stars literally in the sky during the thing called Stars in the Sunlight. So that's like kind of cool.
Oh, I love that. So tell me more about Blackout Night. Did you there was a special panel discussion that happened prior, or like a community conversation that you engaged in?
Yes. So last night was also pretty tricky with Blackout Night. So originally it was going to be canceled because the rain was going to go through it all day. And then the sun came out and I was just like, yay, God loves Black people. We're going to do a show. And then we went to the theater, but High Park had a power outage. So we had lights, but no sound. And it was like something that like, we were like, oh no, why did this have to happen on Blackout Night? But the vibe of it really shifted. We had people sit so much closer to the stage, like, and it became like an acoustic version. Everybody is able to come to the show and like have their ticket redeemed for another night. But we were like, we really wanted to take advantage of the fact that there were Black folks who came to see it.
Yeah.
God bless these actors who projected the hell out of themselves and like for people to hear, and everybody who got closer. But yeah, so we didn't get to have a full discussion, like pre-show chat. We had a brief chat with Jordan Lafreniere, who's the associate director and dramaturge on the piece. But on opening night, we're going to have a chat with Meiran Kale, who's the cultural consultant, as well as like hilarious Somali auntie comedian. And we're going to sort of talk about what it means to be a Somali artist, and especially a visible Somali artist. And we're going to, you know, share our own experiences about what that's like. I mean, we have already, but we think that it's an interesting conversation to have openly.
I wanted to, I mean, because I don't know if we actually addressed this. I wanted to know, I mean, you know, I'm watching the show and it just feels to me like, oh, this is obviously autobiography. Like, this is obviously about her trying to, you know, explore, like her thinking about how hard it was for her to become a writer and artist growing up in a refugee family. But again, that's just the assumptions I'm projecting onto it. Tell me, like, clarify.
Yeah, it definitely, like, that part is, it's the generation represented in the show is like a decade like before me, because I was like born in Canada and the Batul character was born in Somalia. So she's a little bit more like my aunties who had a lot of like the in-between experiences where, you know, like most of their life, like teenage life, was in Somalia, and then they were jarred into coming to Canada and like realizing they were probably going to be here for more of their life in Canada than like back home. And what does that mean for them? But the elements in which like Batul is figuring out, you know, what do my dreams mean when my parents have sacrificed so much for me to have an opportunity and a chance. And I feel like a lot of us kind of come to this crossroads as to, you know, am I going to live for myself or am I going to live for others? And what does it mean? Part of the pre-show chat yesterday was like, as I've been working on this piece, the question of like, how can you be independent while still within a community? How can you have your sense of unique self and express that while being like a part of this big, beautiful thing that you also care about and love? So it's a wee bit autobiographical in that sense, for sure.
Well, I mean, I think Huda's gonna like explore that last part more, but in terms of being the individual artistic self within the community. What I actually, what a bit before we get to that, I just wanted to like ask a little bit more about the father character, because I think watching your show gave me an entirely new appreciation of elements from my own life and people in my own life. Like, you know, coming from, you know, I was a refugee from Sri Lanka, right? So like it gave me like this idea of a person who would have been artistic and creative back home, but had that sapped out of them by the refugee experience. I've never had empathy for that, like after like in the same way that I did. Like your show kind of opened me up and gave me new empathetic eyes to that experience. And I was, so did that character come from anyone in your life?
Yeah, well, I definitely was inspired by my dad. It was inspired by a lot of folks. I mean, I feel like it's kind of like a common joke where it's like your cab driver is probably a doctor, right? Like, I feel like it's something that has sort of been an inside joke within our communities about the knowledge and like the full lives that people who, you know, work in either the service industry and the labor industry here had back home compared to what they have here. And I think that there's quite often been the narrative of, you know, the immigrant parent oppresses the child and keeps them from expressing themselves. But there has never been a question about like, okay, how do you get to that point? How do you get to the point where you're trying to, somebody is so afraid about what stability looks like in this country that they tell their kid to not go after their dreams? Like that's not no parent does that easily. So how did that happen? So it just took like going back and like talking to my dad about what his experience was like when he first came here, and like just how he spoke about himself compared to, you know, like the quote unquote where he lives in society amongst other people's eyes. And then that ended up being so reflective in my own journey and realizing that like, you know, parents are just people who had kids. They had dreams, they had ambitions, and they don't want to sacrifice your joy if it wasn't for the fact that they were so preoccupied with their safety and surviving. And the whole point of their sacrifices in my eyes is that we can think about, you know, living rather than surviving. And they gave us that opportunity, and sometimes you just got to remind them of that once in a while.
So one thing you were mentioning that I've actually been really curious about, and this goes back to, I guess, me and Rad also having maybe a different familiarity with the theater world. You were talking about an opening night, and then the first night of the show, I recall you referring to it as the review night?
Preview performances, yeah.
Oh, preview. Okay, preview performances, my mistake. So I wanted to ask this to clarify this because it leads to my next question about I guess community responses and engagement, more so online, about the show. So the first night versus the opening night, what exactly is happening in the theater world? Because I know that there was a clip that circulated from the first night that didn't actually make it into the second night's show.
Let's talk about it. Yeah. So if for folks who don't often visit the theater, which, you know, in a way, why should you? We have preview performances, which is essentially when you play the show in front of an audience for the first time to test out the material before you quote unquote sort of lock the script on opening night. So think of it like screenings, like in film, like when you go and you see a screener, like it's essentially an opportunity for the creative team to continue testing things out. It was the first time actors like fully got to go through the whole thing together in front of people. And this is a stage where like I can still be making edits and tweaks. Like last night I was just like making certain notes about like things to add or things to take out. And so preview performances, like that's what's great about preview audiences, is that you get to come and shape the work. But sometimes I think, because, and again, rightfully so, folks don't have the context of what a preview is versus like what will be in the final product as an opening night. They might think that what they saw was the final product, which I also understand to a degree it is if you're not coming back. But I'm allowed to make some changes. So on our first preview night, we had some folks who were recording, which I love. I absolutely think that it goes back to like what people think correct decorum is in the theater. Record, have a great time, like do your thing. So we have a moment in the show where Zeki is praying Salatul Istikhara, and I translate it as a movement through verse, where he's going through the prayer movements and he's rapping along with what that prayer might sound like. Like, I come to ask you a question, but I mean no disrespect. I can't expect piety to a deity to be my best bet. Yet here I am at wit's end, so send me whatever you've got. I need more than one guardian angel. This will take a whole flock. So like they're
literally an act of prayer.
Literally an act of prayer. And Salatul Istikhara, you know, by the end of the prayer, you get to make a decision. So there were folks who had opinions about the fact that there were prayer on stage or that it was incorporated through music. And it's kind of interesting because like, it's definitely something that like when community members who come in person who respond to it, it's just different than how people have been responding to it. Some have been responding to it online. And I think it opens up a really interesting question when it comes to the fact that because Islam has not been represented very much on stage, what does that mean for the artistic liberties of the creators? Because, you know, those actors are only doing it because, you know, I put it in the script. And that's something that like I put it in because I did stand by it, and I stood by the interpretation of it. To be sensitive, I did like we kind of reblocked the moment, which means like we kind of staged it a little differently to be a little more or less literal, if that makes sense. So the prayer mat is gone. So we adjusted in that case. But at the same time, there is a part of me that's like uncomfortable about that, because what does that mean for Somali artists, especially Somali women, when they feel like they have to be limited in their artistic expression in fear of, you know, getting death threats and responses that, you know, I understand the fear behind, and also the protection that our community has over how we are being represented. I totally understand, and I share that same like reflex and instinct. But at the same time, the more people are afraid to, I think, speak out and do something like this, the less representation we'll have at the end, which puts a lot of pressure on the few that do make it. So I just thought it was an interesting conversation.
No, I mean, I've been thinking about it all week. I think a lot of us have seen it and have observed it and have had a lot of feelings about it, especially our community in the city of Toronto, because this has very much become a diasporic conversation about Toronto Somalis. But I asked about the organization of theater because when we talked about this, and I'm just going to put that on the record, that we had a conversation kind of briefly debriefing what was happening virtually versus what was happening in person. I asked this question because during that conversation was when I really accepted that I do not understand the organization of theater, which is okay. But I recall you telling me that you had a family member, your father specifically, who had already given you feedback about that scene, that you were already implementing into the second night. But before that actually occurred, you were already being
The co-
vilified and doxxed online.
yeah, so my parents got to come to the first opening night, or preview night performance. And like I mentioned, previews are where, like, how does the audience respond, and then, you know, adjust the work in response to that. So my dad, who, you know, I kept, you know, as if you see the show, you know what it's like seeing that show with your dad, and I'm just like turning to him and being like, do you like it? Do you like it? Is it
Oh, well, do you
okay?
approve?
Yeah, do you approve? And then he was having a great time. People, like, yeah, there's a beautiful, like, photo of him at the end of the show that he is just so surprised to see. But he was like, you know what, everything is perfect except maybe the prayer is silent. Maybe the prayer is silent. And I was just like, you know, like, if my dad can get past, you know, all the other, you know, rapping moments and like artistic expression, and he just had that one note, I was just thinking about, like, okay, like, let's see how that note will stand. And I was just going to think on it in terms of the night. And then by the time I woke up the next day, there was already folks who had responded to it online, kind of thinking of that moment as like the final thing. But it's something that, like, you know, like, if I have a message from my cousin, and like, who came to saw the show, and she was just like, you know what, like, yeah, maybe that's the moment that, you know, it's too soon for the community to see something like that, which again is interesting. But that was the whole point of a preview, is to like hear how people respond to it. And like, it was already a conversation beginning, and I think that there were moments in which people had taken it out of so much context that, like, they didn't even know it was a musical. They didn't know Somali folks wrote it. Like, they didn't know, like, it had gone so far into a different place of the internet, where I was also like blocked from like the original post. Like, I wasn't like getting direct messages being like, hey, like, can you reconsider this moment, until way later, until much after it had gone viral. So it almost felt like I wasn't included in the conversation from the jump.
You weren't part of the critique. It was
Yeah.
more of a pylon.
Just because if it was a concern, they would have added me, motherfuckers.
That's actually true. They would have. That's like, it was not critique. It was literally ridicule and blocking. Like, there was no attempts to have a conversation with you. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just kind of happening without. And then eventually it did get to me, and then it was a very confusing mix of things. Like, it was there were folks who were just like, you know what, you can take that moment out, and like, you know, like, the rest, like, still enjoy the rest of the play, to people being like, you shouldn't like write anything at all. And then to folks being like, she's got pronouns in her bio, she's already lost, you know, like, it just ran the gamut as to, you know, I guess the intent of how people of what people actually cared about. Yeah, but it was a wild time. And again, like, it's so, like, I think, you know, like, there was a lot of pressure to respond and to do something like in response to that, but at the same time, it's like, I think this is a conversation within our community, and which is why I'm glad that, like, I got to talk to you about it, and I got to talk to Meiran about it, because she's our cultural consultant. Like, she isn't like an elder in the community who has experienced very similar fringe comments, where people just, you know, especially women, just want you to stop talking sometimes and stop making things.
Yeah, I think at this point, and this is kind of something that I wanted to talk more about, I don't want this, you know, of course, to be a negative conversation. I just want it to be a very real one about the realities of the role of the Somali artist in diaspora, especially for Somali women. Doxing really becomes a component of it. And I'm thinking about even what Rad was saying earlier, and what you were saying earlier about this work being autobiographical, and you really arriving to the stage as an individualistic artist, or individual artist, or individual artistic self in the community, but are being expected to create these grand representations of fictional monoliths of multiple communities, right? As Somalis, we occupy multiple identities. And my reading of the play, I want to be also clear to the audience, to the listener, I have not actually watched it yet. I'm going to go watch it this weekend with my hoyo.
Decide for yourself, baby.
Exactly. But I understand it as, you know, a conversation about a woman and her family in the Somali diaspora, specifically from the location of Toronto, specifically within Canada. I don't see it as a grand representation of, I don't imagine it to be a grand representation of the entire, like all Muslim people, all Somali people across the world. But I think that definitely is within the response from some community members. So I've been thinking a lot about what it means for Somali women artists and activists, right? I'm gonna kind of combine the two of these things because sometimes that cultural political work is aligned. What it means to move without mentorship oftentimes in our fields, not to call us or call folks the firsts or the lonely onlys, but to explore a medium like theater, which we've already hinted at this multiple times in this episode, all three of us. Not a lot of people from our communities have engagement with this medium, right? So my understanding of another Somali play is non-existent because I without outside of the exception of, you know, seeing Shakespeare in high school, I have not gone to the theater, and that's not a reflection of me. That's a reflection, I think, of that world. So what does it mean to move within these mediums without mentorship in our fields or other examples, while also dealing with institutional barriers, and then compounded with community ridicule or doxing in this case, towards women who compel us to think or look outside or feel outside of the box of what is deemed normative in our cultures. And that, you know, working alongside incel culture too. Like what happened to you this weekend, especially within the Somali community, especially here in Toronto, is not new. We've seen this happen to other Dixon artists like Amal Noor, who's talked about being online, or who's dealt with online bullying extensively just by sharing parts of herself through her music that didn't, again, fit within other people's ideas of who she's supposed to be as a Muslim and Somali woman. We've also seen it with Holden Alaye, right? Alaye Hamo, who passed away a few years ago. And a lot of the people who publicly mourned her were also the people who publicly ridiculed her. So I've been thinking a lot about the role of the Somali artists in diaspora, especially from the experiences of women, and the unfair pressures that they have to deal with, not only within their these institutions, but, you know, on this side of the world, but then also within their own communities as well too.
I also I kind of also want to say, like, Somali women from the jump have been amazing for me in this project. Like the people who I've met in person, like yourself, like many other, like just like Toronto come up artists, like they who I've been working on this show for like 5 years, so it's a long time, which means I've been talking to a lot of people about it. And like I think you mentioned like yeah, if they hadn't told me that like they were resonating with the work, if they wanted to keep going, because I do make it for them. I mean, first and foremost, I think that there are certain privileges in like being an artist and only being able to create for yourself, you know, like being like what's something that, you know, 10-year-old Fatuma would have loved to see on stage, and you can like make the show for her and be that specific, because that's not going to be the same for every Somali person. But when I first did the Obsidian Playwrights Unit, that's where like this like I first got like I guess my professional development for this show. There was one other Somali girl in the unit, and you have no idea how much that released me from feeling like I had to tell the representative story to being like I get to tell one Somali story. I get to tell one, and I get to tell my own, because there's literally another girl in this room with me who can tell a different one, and that onus is no longer on me to tell the big one. And I think that that's something that like I really wish that there was more of us, right? Like instead of being very particular about who can speak up, like I'm an artist. Like if you don't like the way I express myself or express moments, that is totally valid for you to have as a response. But it's also a shame when like, you know, those responses scare Somali people out of creating, which means that there aren't other Somali artists who are and I know like Amal took like a hiatus a little bit because of that response. I know that there was that show with Kanan, and it was being directed by Catherine Bigelow that got shut down. And as much as like, again, you might have an issue with the subject of the art, like if you're keeping the people who are from the inside speaking about it, then it just means that we're really handing over the narrative to the people on the outside to speak on behalf of us. So like at least the call is coming from inside the house in this right. And it's a shame. It's a shame, but I do want to say like it's like the internet response to people who like, you know, generally maybe like don't care about musical theater or don't care about, you know, what it is that like I'm hoping to try to do with this work. There have been people who have been in person, like who have like responded in joy of having something like this exist. And it's something that like, you know, being in these spaces, like you mentioned a lot, was hard to navigate, feeling like I was bearing the brunt, and that people kept kind of like asking me to shoulder this like burden of representation, and because there are so few folks in the field. But then I kept telling myself like people will know Dixon Road exists, and like who knows how many folks with Somali folks decide to go into musical theater like this year, or decide to write something this year. And like, you know, like it was something that we were dealing with in terms of casting, which like our cast is incredible and beautiful, and I'm so grateful that of what the work they're doing right now. But in terms of looking for Somali folks, there weren't folks who like have been in musical theater in the game for a minute. And it's like how that spiral will continue to just loop itself if like if I just decided to not do the show. And I was just like, at least the show is the biggest advertisement for a show like this existing. And then inshallah, you know, like who knows where the next production goes, but there will be Somali folks who know about it. For better or worse, they know.
Inshallah. No, I appreciate your response, and I appreciate what you're saying too, because it that's a very real concern in the sense of how, you know, you as an example in many ways can open up the eyes for many, you know, emerging playwrights or baby musical folks to to imagine themselves in these spaces if they already weren't, or if they already were. Something like this can really compel them to go even further in that dream. But I do fear also, you know, the negative response to you, the negative response to Amalna, the negative response that happens to a lot of Somali women across the diaspora. And this is not, of course, exclusive to the Somali community. I think this happens to a lot of quote unquote marginalized communities. I hate that word, but a lot of communities living at the margins who've had to endure a lot of shitty constructions and representations of themselves, right? There's a defensiveness about how we appear or are represented in the world. But
also a particularly sensitive issue when you're a community that's processing trauma.
Exactly.
And when you're processing that trauma, you're very protective of how that trauma is represented and stuff, especially when the community is divided because of colonial forces. And so you all experience it differently, and you all process it differently. And then this one representation is tasked with capturing the whole thing.
Exactly. And it makes me afraid of you know, the tensions that artists like yourself have to endure. What that looks like for the people you're inspiring, the people who are emerging alongside you, or who are quote, you know, for lack of better words, following in your footsteps. The way that this might put them off from even expressing themselves, or even taking themselves to the task to express their unique perspective on, you know, their role in this life, or in their communities, or on whatever lands. Because I've talked about this with other Somali sisters across the diaspora. Like, you and I know each other in our personal lives. You know that I stay talking to various Somali writers and artists across the diaspora. And it was other women who were concerned because they too themselves, some of them with more visibility, maybe dealing with different mediums where we might see ourselves in more. the response has been, you know, if they're going to come for her in the night, they're going to come for me in the morning.
Yep.
So
And it's,
this is
you
not something
can't win.
Exactly.
You can't win, which again is something like why, you know, working on the show and like, you know, doing edits and like we're in the edit period, like I really want to be able to like it almost feels like, and I Mehran, who again, she's an incredible Somali comedian, like who is like been in the game for a minute, and she will tell you like people come for her, but she's just like, they're talking. This is a conversation they didn't have yesterday. Like she spins it in such an incredible, resilient, clearly Somali women way. Like that she's saying like there will be folks who just have an issue with about you opening your mouth. So
Exactly.
and not caring about what comes out of it. And you know, I think that Dixon Road is relatively like an optimistic and positive view of like our inside look into our community. But then there are also other stories that aren't as, you know, sweet and shiny, and are people not allowed to say those either?
Exactly, the ordinariness of, you know, Black life, like both beautiful, ugly, and boring, like everything.
Exactly.
Yeah. But one thing I will always appreciate, I'm not from Dixon, I'm not from the West End, I'm Somali from the East End. But must clarify in this conversation. And I clarify that because, you know, I've always been, alhamdulillah, around my community, but numbers in the East End are significantly different than it is in the West End, and anyone in Toronto knows that, particularly if you have, if you've been blessed to grow up in a community like Dixon, which I'm looking at from the outside. But we have talked about this numerous times. I've talked about Dixon before. You've been talking about Dixon for the many years that I've known you. We are deeply aware as Somali women in the city, how negative the image has been, what negative stuff has been projected onto Dixon. That is obviously a result of Islamophobia and anti-Blackness, and a particular anti-African anti-Blackness here in this country. And I just want to bring this up one last time. I've said it like a million times to you already. But even as a researcher, like in my doctoral work, it was actually seeing what happened to Dixon that compelled me to go and do a PhD looking at constructions of Somalis. And for many years, you know, anytime I was typing in Dixon into my search engines, the results was always centered around the criminalization of our community, the Rob Ford crackgate fiasco, never the beauties or the ordinary parts of what Dixon looked like, right? And you know, this play in many ways is, which is why I called the article what I called it, is the beginning of you really helping compel us to reimagine the narrative of Dixon in a way that doesn't have to like strictly juxtapose, you know, the criminalization. Is just showing this is what ordinary, this is just what ordinary life looks like, at least ordinary to my community and ordinary to others. And I'll always forever be grateful for that. So thank you for offering us your art and offering us your work.
I'm happy to mess with the algorithm anytime.